Thank you all so much for hosting this lovely evening, and thank you for the barbecue. It was phenomenal. It was fantastic. I had so much fun, so thank you. Now, we just have so much to get through and so little time that I'm going to jump right into the speech. No jokes, which is unusual, but maybe we'll sprinkle some here or there throughout the speech if time permits. We have a problem, and you know what that problem is. We have a problem, and it's that the government in Ottawa is bad, and it's always been bad, and it continues to be bad. It was bad from the start. It was bad in the 80s with the NEP. It was bad in the 70s, and it was bad in the 90s with the GST. It was bad all of these times, and it continues to be bad. But it would be one thing if it were only bad. You see, it would be one thing if the government in Ottawa were wrong, and just wrong, and that was the only thing it was. Because if it were just wrong, you could grapple, and you could wrestle, and you could discuss with the government in Ottawa. You could try and change its mind, and perhaps you could change its mind. Perhaps if you discussed enough, perhaps if you wrestled enough, perhaps if you presented enough proof, enough logic, enough points that detail your position, you could, in fact, change Ottawa's mind. And they would restructure Confederation to work for Alberta. They would return to the supremacy of God. They would return to a society that's constructed on law, on truth, on justice. If the government were purely wrong, you could change their mind, and perhaps they would do that. Perhaps. But the government in Ottawa is not just wrong. It's more than that. You see, the government in Ottawa is worse than bad. They're worse than wrong. Government in Ottawa, the House of Commons, and I do not say this lightly or facetiously, the government in Ottawa is insane. I suppose they might sue me, but what are you going to do? They're insane. And that's a true claim, and I mean that honestly. You see, you have individuals in government elected into positions in Ottawa, and they learn their ideals, they learn their ideologies starting in school, so young. Government schools, right from the start, right from kindergarten, from preschool, they're taught to worship the state, to worship government. Without government, what would you do? Without government, who would teach you? Without government, who would house you? Without government, who would insure you? Who would clothe you? They're taught right from the start to worship this massive bureaucracy that watches everything they do. And then they're reared up into higher levels of education. They're taught the same thing in middle school, in grades 7 and 8 and 9. They're taught to worship the state. They're taught that socialism is an ideal form of government. They're taught that big government, radical government, progressivism, modernism are things desirable which they should work to achieve and attain. And the same is true in the high schools. This indoctrination only continues, and as you know, it seems to summit at the university. You have all of these politicians in prominent positions of power today who learned what they're legislating in university. There they go, perhaps they're still innocent, perhaps they are not yet indoctrinated, and yet they step into the lecture hall and they sit perhaps at the front or perhaps in the middle, and they turn off their minds to listen to a professor lecture to them for an hour and a half on the evils of small government, or the evils of classical liberalism, or the evils of freedom. And after 4 years, of course, their mind cracks. But they're not set forth into the world. That's the wrong terminology. Instead, those individuals are set loose, like a pack of rabid dogs, into, as I mentioned, positions of power. They go into law, and they go into administration, and as you know, they go into politics. And then they achieve these thrones of power, and from that position, by their scepter, they introduce this ideological insanity into the rest of the country, and so it trickles down, and it affects all of us. Now, that's a bold claim to make, I know. It's not so easy to just say, well, the government's insane, and that's that. You have to prove such a claim, because it's not a small claim. It's not a mild claim. It's an extraordinary claim, perhaps. And so how can you prove it? I can prove it as such. It seems clear to me that government is insane because of the laws they pass, their actions. There's an old author named Chesterton. I love reading him. And he has a quote in his book called Orthodoxy that goes something like this. It says, I'm paraphrasing and I'm using different terminology, but the truth is the same. Insane things do not strike insane men. If insane things actually struck insane men, they would be sane. You look at all of the laws that government is passing. You look at what they're trying to accomplish. You look at what they're trying to do. And the fact that they do not revile in shock when they say such things or pass such laws is proof to me that they are, in fact, insane. Let me give you some examples. Look at the monetary system, for example. They told us month after month and year, well, now soon to be after year, that you could print and print and print money and you could give it to you for no charge, no cost, and yet there would be no inflation. You could have the central bank, they said, print all the money in the world and play this nonsensical, magical game with the government, where the government says, I need you to print money. And the central bank says, fine, give me a bond and I'll give you some cash. And that seems legitimate, out of thin air. They told us they can play this game and there will be no consequences, no repercussions. And the reality is, there are consequences. There are repercussions. Look at the inflation we have. Or look, for example, at their arrest of the protesters. Here you have protesters, entirely peaceful, courageous, brave, admirable, doing nothing wrong, exercising their constitutional right to protest what they believed quite properly to be wrong. And what were they challenged with? Arrests, fines, bank seizures, bank closure, account closure, asset freezes, all of these things that make no logical sense whatsoever to logical men. But if you are perhaps not logical, then you realize that in their mind it makes sense. And this, in my opinion, was cumulated. It reached its climax with all of these lockdowns. What were we told when government locked down? What did they tell us when we were supposed to stay in our homes and do nothing and see no one and not host, that's right, 2 weeks, not host barbecues, not go to dances, wear masks everywhere? What was the justification? After we showed them science and we showed them opposite views from legitimate, certified doctors, for example, when we showed them all of these things, they said in return, we're doing these things, we're locking you down, we're locking the hospitals down because I am who I am. They stole this quote from the Exodus, from the divine, and they used it for themselves. I am who I am. We're closing because I am. We're closing because I'm in power. We're locking you down because I am. And so you realize the height of this insanity has summited to a position where these men and women in power have decreed and declared themselves to be practically divine, God. Precisely correct. You should be up here speaking. You're exactly right. There's no need to have me speak. Excellent. Now, it's quite clear why this is true. And I know I'm taking a while in this first part. The next parts won't be so long, but this is so critical to understand. These men and women declared themselves practically to be gods. Why did they do so? You see, the foundation of society is truth. The foundation of society is law, or it's one of the foundations, one of the most important foundations. Self-evident laws, objective laws, laws which you and I know are true and exist. You need them. Without them, society crumbles. But you must understand, the purpose of the law is thus. It's to tell you, and it's to tell me, and it's to tell the volunteers at the back, it's to tell the mayor, it's to tell the premier how to act human. It gives you a blueprint, a manual, a book that outlines how to act civilized, how to be civilized, how to act human, how to exist in a kingdom that's higher than the animal. You go outside, you see a mother owl eat one of her young because it's starving, and you say, well, that's nature. But if someone were to do such a heinous and contemptible thing in the human kingdom, They would be worthy of the most severe punishment, and rightfully so, because we live in a kingdom that's different than the animals, and we're told how to live in the law. That law, that self-evident law, that law which shall not be violated, encoded in a proper constitution, tells you how to be human, and it molds the society. So, government had to emancipate itself from that law. The government in Ottawa has rejected that law. They've thrown it out. To them, it no longer has meaning, because their purpose, as you know, or more accurately, right, their handler's purpose is to reshape society into their image. They want to reshape you, and they want to reshape me into a new and contemptible image, which we're not supposed to be. And so they had to throw out the law in order that they might become the law itself. I am who I am. We're locking down because I am. I'm the standard of right and wrong. Now you see how deadly this is, how dangerous this is. Because by doing so, by stepping outside of the bounds of law, of right and wrong, they didn't step into a paradise. They didn't step into a Marxian utopia. They stepped instead into a void. Contemptible, cold, merciless, unfeeling, an abyss. They stepped into this area and have traded their humanity for something else. You see, my concern, my present concern, the reason I'm working with APP is not because I fear or I'm afraid of being ruled by bad men and women, even though they are indeed bad men and women. My fear is being ruled by individuals who are no longer men at all. See, by trading in the law, by saying it no longer applies to me, I am the law, you trade your humanity. We're being ruled by mere artifacts. Men and women who no longer know what it means to be human, so that they can decide for you what humanity shall henceforth mean. Now, we have tried, as you know, in Confederation to navigate this problem, the insanity of the Laurentian government. We have worked our hardest. We have tried, for example, negotiating. You know this as well as I know this. We've negotiated with Ottawa. We've proposed this. We've proposed that. Premiers have traveled by plane. Premiers have come and gone. They proposed something with oil. They proposed something with plastics. They proposed something with the rest of the provinces. They do all of these things. They've tried all of these things. We've tried all of these things. And yet nothing has changed. 10 years ago it was true. 20 years ago it was true. 30 years ago it was true. 70 years ago it was true. It's always been true. No matter how much you negotiate, no matter how hard you try, you cannot influence the decisions of Ottawa. We do not possess the leverage. Confederation was set up in such a way to ensure that we do not possess the leverage. It was set up in such a way that you and I might realize or understand that Alberta is nothing more in the eyes of Ottawa than an engine, an economic engine, providing the power for the actual Confederation itself. But you understand, and I know, that an engine has no thought. It does what the driver wants it to do. It has no say in the matter. When the driver steps on the fuel, the engine increases. When the driver releases the fuel, the engine slows down. And so all of this was set up in such a way that Alberta might do what Ottawa wants it to do, produce. But not too much, otherwise you'd build more pipelines. At any rate, we're seen as this engine. Well, then we try with voting, we say. Maybe we'll change the Constitution. Let's try and vote our way out of this mess. After all, we live in the blessing of a democracy. Only the fewest of societies, of generations have ever been able to enjoy in the whole of history. And we have an opportunity, at least in some capacity, granted to us to vote. So maybe we'll try and change it. But you can't. How? Look at the distribution of votes. You look at PEI, for example, and you realize that one MP in the House of Commons represents 41,000 individuals from Prince Edward Island. But then you scrutinize Alberta, and you realize that one individual in the House of Commons from Alberta represents 120,000 individuals. And you see that there's this massive discrepancy, this massive differential in the voting power of those in the East versus the voting power of those in the West. And there are reasons for this. There's a senatorial clause and a grandfather clause and every other clause you can think of. But the fact remains, the distribution of power is not equal. And this is made, of course, all the more evident when you look at the populations of Quebec, of Ontario, of the eastern provinces compared to the West. And so you can't vote your way out. Well, then perhaps you can change the Constitution. Again, you cannot. It's impossible. This is not my word. This is the words of a man named Richard Albert from the University, I believe, of Texas, who said, when you look at all of the factors that are required to change the Constitution, when you take every single factor into account, you realize that constitutional amendment in the country of Canada is impossible. You cannot do it. You say, why is that? Well, you read how you have to change the Constitution. First, if you want to change the Constitution, say to eliminate equalization from the Constitution, you have to get the approval of 50% plus of the House of Commons. They have to approve and vote to open the Constitution and change it. It's a rough start. But then suppose by miracle, you pass that, then you have to get the Senate's approval. The exact same thing, 50%. Open the Constitution and change it. If you pass that, then you must get 7 out of 10 provinces, representing 50% of the population voting in favor. That means you must have at least one of Ontario or Quebec voting for you to open the Constitution and change it. And then, of course, you must navigate Quebec's regional veto, which was granted to them as a consequence of remaining in Confederation. And who here thinks that will happen with equalization? And then finally, of course, you have to maneuver around the Supreme Court, which you cannot. You have 9 justices. 7 of them are from the East. 2 of them are from the West. And so you see the discrepancy of power. Well, finally, we'll try the Sovereignty Act, I've heard, and that's becoming increasingly popular. Now, there are some aspects of the Sovereignty Act that the APP likes. That's true. And we need our own version of a Sovereignty Act. That's correct. But there is a problem with the present Sovereignty Act that's being proposed. What's the problem? Let me explain it for you like this. Suppose the Sovereignty Act is passed in Alberta. That's a big step, but suppose it happens. Suppose that the government of Alberta says, Ottawa, to you, and they snarl like a bulldog. Like every premier has snarled like a bulldog to Ottawa when they come into power. We're no longer collecting carbon tax. We're not doing it. 0 cents per liter in Alberta, as it should be. Well, on the other side of the system, you have Ottawa, who certainly will not take such authority lightly. And it's undoubtable that they'll reply, no, you will take the carbon tax. You will collect it. We will get our money. This is not your jurisdiction. And the Sovereignty Act and the Alberta government will say, yes, it is. And Ottawa will say, no, it's not. And they'll have a back and forth. Presumably, Ottawa could start withholding transfer payments, billions of dollars every year. As you know, we send them 60 billion. We get back in the area of 30. It varies. We need that money. And so it's very easy for them to just withhold a couple of billions of dollars. But if that doesn't happen, or perhaps in conjunction with that, Ottawa can say, fine, it's going to the Supreme Court. And that's not a day ruling. It's not a month ruling. That will stay locked up for a decade, for years. We don't have years. And that's just for a carbon tax. And even when that's resolved, even when that problem, just the carbon tax, is resolved, how do you suppose the Supreme Court will rule? You know, and I know. And that's, again, that's just the carbon tax, let alone all of the other constitutional matters they propose to take control of. So then, what are we doing here? What is the solution? What's the sanity? That's the question I want to answer. What is the sanity? Independence, as you could probably guess. I am a proponent of independence. The APP believes that freedom and prosperity comes through independence. Alberta needs its independence. That's why we exist, and we need it now. It's been 116 years, and you see and I see what's looming on the horizon. It's a storm cloud, and it's not small. It is this ominous, all-encompassing hurricane, not just of one government, not just of two governments. This whole omnicompetent technocracy that men and women in the shadows are pushing their hardest to introduce across the world. So we need independence. How do you do it? What are the steps? Is there a logical, rational way you do it? There is. We spent thousands of hours vetted through constitutional lawyers, vetted through brilliant men and women to determine the steps. They are thus, and this is oversimplified. You can read the rest on our website if you haven't already. The first thing you have to do is educate as many Albertans as possible on the benefits and merits of independence. That, to me, seems self-evident. You must do so. There are still countless Albertans who do not understand, who have not researched, who do not know of the benefits and merits of independence, of which there are many. Now, step two is to plant and nurture and grow the APP's membership to such a capacity that we compose, and this seems to be the magic number, at least 3.5% of the voting population. Now, I say 3.5% because there was a study completed by Dr. Erica Chenoweth out of Harvard, where it was said, it was discovered that if you scrutinize and research societal movements across history, you see that if 3.5% of a relevant population is actively engaged in one specific movement, they will direct and drive the society in said direction that they want it to go. And so 3.5% of the Alberta voting population, which is the relevant population, is about 120,000 individuals, give or take a little bit, given on the year. But already we're seeing phenomenal influence. Politicians have come to meetings. You hear politicians using the words like freedom and prosperity, Sovereignty Act, independence, et cetera, et cetera. They know there's a movement here. There's something coming. There's something bigger. And they're starting to realize it. Now, the third step, of course, is to mobilize those numbers. You have as many Albertans as possible congregated together in a movement like this, and you exercise your presence. You show the politician who you are and what we think and what we believe and what we don't want but need in the province. And you do so to such a fantastic capacity that the politician recognizes, he or she realizes that in order to be elected, which is what they want to be, they have to get in front of your movement. They must endorse what you're preaching, what you believe. Because if they don't, they realize they won't get elected. This is a famous quote from Klein, who said, as a politician, you have to find a parade and get in front of it. Now, you might counter. You might say, what if the will of the people is not my own? What if it's different? What if the will of the people is to lock my business down? It's a good question. What if, through vigorous propaganda, they're persuaded to support, for example, new restrictions, new passports? The question is welcome. It's needed. But the answer is, this is why we're proposing Alberta become a sovereign constitutional republic. You must understand the necessity of the republic. Because the republic is a governance by law, not by a mob, no matter how big the majority. It's governed by a foundation of law that says no matter what, you cannot violate these precepts. It might be that the whole of the nation, except for one man, thinks, believes. It might be that all men believe that stealing should be legal, and the law says no, it cannot be. Your democratic will disregards the rule of law, and so your democratic will is illegitimate. You have to protect the individual rights first in order to protect societal rights. Now, step 4 is, with said numbers, of course, you must elect an independence-focused government in 2023, and then you have to have a referendum on independence. You must. And you have to have that as soon as possible. The parties can debate when to have that. That's a political question. But it must be held, in my opinion, as soon as possible. You have to hold it now, as quickly as possible. not 40 years down the line, not 50, as soon as possible. Because again, you see all that's coming. Now, we're often said, well, a referendum on independence, a question like, do you want independence? Well, you're leaving Canada. You're betraying Canada. We are not. Not at all. We're not betraying Canada. We're not leaving Canada. Instead, we're trying to save it. It has been granted to Alberta to lead this movement. It doesn't stop at just Alberta. It goes so much farther than that. Once one province becomes independent and shows the rest of the world, the rest of the country, the continent, that indeed it's possible and that prosperity abounds as a consequence of independence, think of what all the other provinces will do, questioning and wondering and actually acting as they too look for freedom and prosperity and indeed procure their own independence. Now, we're also, as Blair mentioned, often questioned whether we are a political party or not. We are not. We are not. That is not our mandate. That is not our purpose. We are an independent educational project with the sole purpose of educating as many Albertans as possible on the benefits and merits of independence. Our nonprofit status means that we're freed from all of this political regulation that ties down the parties and doesn't enable them to speak in the manner that we are. We know that of course we have parties and politics, but you must also educate the Albertan. He must be educated and she must be educated on the reasons for why we're doing what we're doing. And then, of course, step 5, after you elect this independent government, before the referendum, I should have put this first, but nonetheless, you do adopt your own version of a Sovereignty Act that enables you to take control of things which are legal under the Constitution. What we're doing is you want to make the transition from in-confederation to independence as smooth as possible. We do not want to force a man to jump off a cliff into the water. We want to give him a slide. And so if you can introduce things like your own Alberta pension plan, collecting provincial taxes, taking control of immigration matters, et cetera, before independence actually occurs, when it does happen, it will be so much more smooth, without hiccups and without bumps. So then, to my final question, how can you get involved to help us achieve this objective? Well, firstly, please consider purchasing a membership, right? These memberships are legitimate proof for MLAs, for politicians, that they need in order to understand the massive scope and size of this movement. The more members we have, of course, the less able MLAs are to dismiss the influence of our movement. The larger the group, the larger explicitly the group, the more the politician is forced to reconcile with the fact that there is a growing number of Albertans who want political change in the province and the country. As well, we invite you to become a member and to become part of our community, to receive updates and information and news and articles and research topics and newsletters and responses to all of these happenings on in the province. We were forced into isolation for 2 years, a long, long time, right? But no more of that. Here we are enjoying a barbecue. Here we are enjoying an event. I went to a dance the other day. All of these things that are human and that humans enjoy have to be protected and upheld no matter what. And so that's part of the reason why we exist. Now, finally, some say that by pursuing again independence, we're abandoning Canada. But I told you once, I must tell you again, because it's true, we are not. We're not abandoning Canada. I cannot hammer that point enough. It's one of the strictest critiques we receive. It's the opposite. It's been appointed to you as Albertans to lead the way. Through socialism, government is stealing our capacity to generate wealth, but then demands equalization and enterprise, right? They tell us we're free. You're free, you're free, they say, while they seize our bank assets and accounts for supporting a convoy. We cannot go on tolerating this type of treatment forever. We're not destroying the foundations, you see? We're trying to build them up. Alberta is a house of many mansions, and that's true. But right now, those mansions are occupied not by hardworking Albertans, but by big bureaucrats and heavy government, stealing and enjoying the fruits of our labor. It's true. That's why we formed APP. We're not just holding this home steady, we're working, as you know, to make it better and stronger and freer and more peaceful so that our children will be free from tyranny and their children will be free from tyranny, and that for all Albertans, there will be a house that is built in justice and freedom where there is room for all. Thank you.